I'm Jessy Olson. We're in Woodburn, Oregon. It's about 30 miles south of Portland. And I got here as part of the Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellowship in Community Development. And that's a 3-year position that's awarded each year. A couple fellows are awarded in different places all over the country to link up emerging architects with community development corporations. I had a professor who was interested in minimal dwellings, and kind of through that it got me interested in just affordable housing in general. And then looking into affordable housing right away, I kind of picked up on the idea of farm worker housing as a subset of affordable housing. And once I started diving into the data related to that and just the huge need, not just in Oregon but all over the US for farm worker housing, I couldn't ignore it. It was something that really called out to me. It was kind of a series of events. The first moment was looking at the data. There's hundreds of thousands of farm workers in Oregon, and it's one of our biggest industries, and it's the lowest paid industry. And the housing, because of a whole host of reasons related to discrimination, a lack of English speaking in the population, immigrant rights issues, and just a really long history of labor issues related to farm workers in general, have led to just a lack of housing that's unbelievable. That kind of stood out to me on paper. Right away I was like, well, what's out there? Let me go see. And at the time I happened to be working at an Italian restaurant in Portland, and a couple of the cooks that I worked with were recent Mexican immigrants. So I started asking them, do you know about the farm worker housing in this area? Because it's primarily Mexican immigrants. And one of the cooks said, yeah, I live near one of the camps. Do you want to go see it? And that was kind of the in for me, because you don't just show up at a farm worker labor camp. I mean, we do tours of them through FHGC, but as someone who wasn't affiliated with an organization like this, it's kind of hard to get that connection. You can't call up a labor camp owner and say, hey, I want to come photograph your camp, I'm doing research, So I happened to have this guy that I worked with at the Italian restaurant, and he took me to see the camp, and I was appalled. It was shocking. And I've traveled, a lot, and it was not up to US standards of housing. A lot of people, when I talk to them, have that same kind of question, like, how does this exist? And that's taken me a long time to even dig through the surface of, and I'm still not an expert. We work with a lot of people who have a long and like a whole host of knowledge that I don't have about the history of the farm worker conditions in this country and locally. But from what the little I do understand, it's just historically the immigrant population in this country hasn't been treated with a lot of respect, and farm workers in general were omitted from a lot of the labor laws that were set up in the early 30s. So a lot of people assume that everyone's covered under labor laws. Everyone gets minimum wage, right? Everyone has a right to breaks, right? Not right. When you start digging a little bit, you realize that the farm workers are a subset of the population that are omitted from a lot of these things that we as Americans just assume if you're working, you meet these criteria. And the housing piece just kind of goes along with that. Because they're underpaid, they don't speak English, and they are kind of at the mercy of their employers, the housing that is provided in these labor camps might be their only option. So FHGC started in 1991, and we were a subset of PCUN, who is the Farm Worker Labor Union for the state. PCUN has a long history of working on immigrant labor rights issues. And Woodburn is really the center of the immigrant rights movement, really in the Northwest and in Oregon especially. And so PCUN has a long-standing history in that, in the whole movement in general. In the early 90s, PCUN realized, okay, we need housing. How are we going to make that happen? Well, we should just start developing it. And of course, it wasn't as easy as that with the political racism in the area at the time. But they ended up building this property that we're on right now. It's called Nuevo Monacer, and it was the first farm worker housing project to utilize low-income housing tax credits, which was a big deal for that. It's a national low-income housing funding program that people use all over. And for it to be used for farm worker housing was a pretty big deal. And to kind of overcome a mayor that didn't want to see it happen and kind of neighbors that didn't want to see it happen was a big coup for the movement. So in short, the goal is to create more housing for farm workers. And kind of one thing that FHGC prides itself on is it's not just housing, it's not just a shelter, but it's a community. And a community that has services. We have a really active community organizing and resident services arm. We provide education programs, health programs, after-school programs. There's a Head Start right here in our community center. So it's not just housing, but it's helping people improve their lives. And that's the whole goal at FHGC. This is a really different position than working in an architecture firm. I'm not acting as an architect. I actually can't legally call myself an architect regardless because I'm not licensed. But I do have my hand in the design process all the time. But I'm acting as a community developer, which is a really different position for someone coming out of architecture school. And I love it, and it's what I'm gonna do. You know, that's one of the most exciting things about this fellowship is it really introduces architects to just a whole nother world of what you can do with your degree. Because it all comes down to creative problem solving, and whether that's drawing a building or working on community development funding, working with neighbors, organizing, you know, a city council meeting or something like that. All of that is creative problem solving. So it's really related, but it's not something that you think of when you're in architecture school. I think it's hard to know when you're kind of in it. I think that I've become more knowledgeable, for one thing, in terms of farm worker housing and just the process of community development. I mean, when I walked in here, I didn't know what a pro forma was. I didn't know what a housing tax credit was, kind of all these tenets of development. But it's also really opened my eyes to how people live in buildings that we design. Because as an architect, you know, you draw a building, you put the best of intentions into it, but then you don't necessarily follow up. And working within the community like I am here, every time I walk outside, I see how people are living in their buildings. I see what works, what doesn't. You know, this is kind of a particular population. They have particular needs, and what are those needs, and how can that be reflected in a better design? And to me, that's a really special experience. It proves how important this position is for my organization to want me to stay and to want to fund it on their own. I think the fellowship has something like an 80% rate of fellows who stay with their CDCs, which is really impressive to me because these are organizations who would have hired someone with an architectural background on their own. But through the program, you know, it's funded, they got this person, and then they realize that someone who comes with a design background kind of has this knowledge base that they didn't have before. And, you know, everyone works on different sorts of things, and I've been kind of thrown into more of a development project manager role than an architect role. But I think it speaks highly of the program that they want me to stay. And to me, when I'm looking at my 5-year plan, I want to keep making a difference in the lives of the farm workers around here. I would hope that people look a little deeper at their neighbors. You know, I think, and looking at, we're talking about farm workers, this is specific. This is where our food comes from, you know, and I have a lot of conversations with colleagues who work in the kind of sustainable food or organic food industry, and I really try to make the connection to people that, you know, you want healthy food. Part of that is creating an environment, a healthy working and living environment for farm workers in this country and locally too. And so I'd hope that it might open someone's eyes to think about the farm worker population in a different way.